Once upon a time in the Ireland of quite long ago, I thought I wanted to be a publisher, and I published and had this book printed. I thought this was going to be the profession I would settle into, and it would be such a contrast to working out in the wet and cold on farming and growing potatoes and building buildings for farmers and all that and all other forms of country misery. To explain, in the 1970s, my wife and I bought and developed a bookshop called the Knocknagow Bookshop, which went on to become a very significant provincial bookshop in Ireland. But back in the 70s, leading into the 80s, it was kind of nervous. I had, over the previous year, just come into the business from my building and farming background. And I had a mission. I thought I could not be happy just being behind the counter, a counter jumper, as we say. So I felt I would have to be an entrepreneurial bookseller, which in fact then leads on to the whole subject of publishing. And very, very quickly, in my first year, in out of the rain, as a fellow farmer and builder described my new situation, I came up with the idea of publishing an old favourite from our neighbourhood. And thus, a medium-sized truckload of hardcover copies were delivered to our premises in November 1980. Hundreds of brown paper parcels practically filled the small storeroom. After many delays, I was relieved that I finally had received from the printers this facsimile of the second edition of the scrapbook. And with its gold embossed green cloth cover and antique wove paper, it really looked quite handsome. I spent a goodly while fondling the first finished copy I'd seen, sensing its textures and breathing in its smell. Like a miser in his counting house, I felt a choking gratification being surrounded by such plenty. All mine, all mine, I was tempted to think. All this, and I was only the publisher, not the writer. The product, not the content, was the physic then. This is what you call nowadays a spoiler. I was not to know then that I really was not cut out to be a publisher, and certainly not a publisher of what I suppose later I would have regarded as banal local history books. But then I was swept away with the excitement of this new activity. Now, this little indulgence that I was enjoying was very pleasant, but it had to be brief. Many thousands of pounds were owed to the printer and binder, not to mention the bank, who hadn't even been told of this brave new venture of mine. Now, the books, like any other commodity, indeed like the potatoes that I had so recently grown and marketed, would have to be shifted off the shelves. The harsh reality was that 2/3 of that truck delivery of waxed paper bound hardcover books had to be sold just to break even. And that had come into the equation at the time. I sold 2 in the first week. My normally supportive bank manager quaked, but he did honour my checks to the printers and the binders. My staff, including my wife, I felt, began to pity me. But we sold in a relatively small then provincial bookshop 369 copies on Christmas Eve, the best-selling non-fiction book in the whole of Ireland on that Christmas Eve. And despite all that incredible success and all the accolades that came with it, it was February before we were making a profit. I wondered why I should have doubted, after all, James White, modestly calling himself the compiler. Sorry, he was the original, we call him the writer of the book. He'd sold thousands of copies in a couple of editions since 1907. His sales period had spanned world wars, civil wars, revolutions, depressions, the proliferation of cars, planes, wireless, cinema, and so on. His My Clonmel Scrapbook sold steadily throughout, and perhaps despite cataclysmic changes. Why has this book exerted such an enduring, nostalgic appeal over so many for almost a century? The scrapbook does not pretend to be a history of Clonmel. It conceded that ground earlier to Canon Burke's monumental history of Clonmel, to which, incidentally, White was said to have also contributed substantially. The scrapbook has an ostensibly gentler remit, unfettered by chronology or the demands of historiography. Indeed, it is really a scrapbook. And on one level, that is what it appears to be, a personal recollection of local past events that interested the collector or the compiler, the writer, whatever. It preserves, in timeless amber cameos of the past, romances, historical sketches, stories, poetry, and songs, chosen chiefly, I imagine, to entertain. A bit like what I'm doing on YouTube now, but hopefully I have a sharper edge. The editor, himself a scion of a successful family business that, amongst other things, imported tea and wine, also insinuates a genteel Catholic nationalism into a cosy middle-class view of a town and countryside. White was also a local councillor who played a prominent part in raising funds for various local welfare causes and for the establishment of schools in the town. The family business was in Gladstone Street. He died in 1924 at the age of 72. Because of this comfortable bourgeois background, it is not therefore surprising that a strong self-censorship can be ascertained at work throughout the book. The dark side, the necessary balancing side of local and indeed all history, is sidestepped and ignored. There was a particularly narrow view of the world from the standpoint of those who comprised the provincial post-Victorian Irish elite, the merchant, often the gombeen man risen in the world, the strong farmer, many of them stronger since the famine through land grabbing and high food prices, which they forced on the population during the famine years, and the triumphant, invariably, clergy. Catholic clergy, of course. If this was the only book that one read about Clonmel, you would be forgiven for forming the impression that it was a place where the citizens, although wronged, did no wrong, and where the predominant local characteristic was acute glick, especially when confronting judicial authority. Half a dozen of the stories, entries, whatever, deal with remarkable trials. Social conditions are not touched upon. The workhouse, the asylum, and the fever hospital have no place here. You won't find an account in these pages of one of the most shocking events ever to take place in Clonmel, the botched hanging of the Cody brothers in 1848, probably because those Robin Hood-like characters were a threat to the editor's shopkeeper, stroke merchant, stroke farmer class. After all, Clonmel, Clonmala, was the bread, butter and bacon capital of the south of Ireland in the 19th century, where so much extra wealth was made during the famine. The witch burning of Clonmel trial took place only 12 years before the first edition of the book was published. The world read about that terrible event then and for years afterwards. The scrapbook was silent. The dreadful beheading of her children by the religiously manic Mrs. Sadleir must still have been one of the most talked about, gossiped about horrors at the time White was collecting his material. On this too, the book is totally silent. Land war, tenants' league, white boys, and outrages, for which South Tipperary was so notorious, are not dealt with here either. Inexplicably, unless one ascribes shame, the famine of 6 years before is not even mentioned. I might be accused of carping too much, being unreasonably critical of a book modest in ambition and naive in content. But I believe it is more than it seems. It was very professionally printed and published, and it reached a very large audience. Indeed, it still does. I hope. In the last few years alone, it has been much quoted in newspapers, magazines, radio, and television. Often presented to dignitaries, including recently our president, and prized by the antiquarian bookseller when out of print, the book obviously fulfills a need for the sentimental long look back. It was bought in thousands in hard times. Whatever one might say about its selective remembering, its blend of story, historical anecdote, and poetry has something of the power of our Shanachie tradition in it. A tradition, however, that is very different from the pre-famine one that survived in other parts of the country. Copper fastening, a calculating materialism, is an absorbing business, leaving little room for nourishing a culture, a genuine culture. The scrapbook is a kind of scrabbling for a new view, a culture that best represents the improvements of the new post-famine values and materialism and buries that of the dispossessed. From the guilty silence of the prosperous countryside, it emerges as a new voice. And still, bearing all this in mind, there is still pleasure to be gained from the book. C.J. Boland's story of the Carrick canine, dog, who would leave no dog alive within a mile of him, is priceless. He's often quoted The Two Travellers is a rollicking Robert Service-like ballad celebrating a chirpily patriotic sense of place. And most of the place names mentioned there are very, very local to where I was brought up north of Clonmel. For the remarkable Boland's 20 contributions of poems and stories, the book is more than worth purchasing. And there is so much else that can be dipped into for an overall flavour of pre-independence provincial life. I was recently very glad to read the chapter in Clonmel, the Assizes, 1830, to get detail and atmosphere of the courthouse in Nelson Street, which was not available elsewhere. I can well appreciate why the veteran broadcast on RTE, Ciarán Mac Mahuna, has lauded the scrapbook as his favourite desk-side book, it giving him continuously rich material for his own singular style of trip down memory boreen. That it deserves a place on the shelf, then, is without question. I should emphasize that most of what I've been reading is actually a foreword that I wrote for a friend of mine who published a subsequent edition of the scrapbook. Now, he was of a Protestant faith. Forgive me, Phil, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but you had become a kind of a very, very skillful entrepreneurial printer publisher yourself. And we were very good friends, and Phil asked me to write a foreword to the new edition. And I was glad to do that because I had been continuing my education. I thought it was all finished when I ran away from college back in the early 70s, but no, it was going on apace. And I was learning day by day, month by month, year by year, event by event. I didn't know it back then, but I was heading towards becoming an activist, and eventually I became an activist, political activist at first. The Reagan visit in the 1985 and so on. And then after being in the Amazon in 1986 and so on, I became an activist, if you like, an environmental activist, I suppose. I was early to the table of environmental activism, and then went on to become a demonstration, or to develop a demonstration farm for organic practices and so on. But anyway, less of that, and back to my foreword. And back to the book. I basically had to be, I suppose, supportive of my friend. And I went on to say that the book deserves a place on the shelves. That is without question. But I repeat, it should not be viewed as a comprehensive history book. I stress this because, in my experience, it was mostly bought to feed a sort of self-satisfied, nationalist, provincial, urban view of history for the home and the exile market. Its serious limitations should be guarded against. Rose-tinted glasses with blinkers on gives an ugly lie to our past. It should be taken instead, if you'll forgive the metaphor, as a light-hearted dessert to the main course meat and bones of a history of South Tipperary that continues, like all history, to be written and rewritten. I think, I go on in the foreword, it is incumbent upon us to be well informed about the past. To ignore it, as Edmund Burke has it, is to be condemned to repeating it. To study the history of one's own area is a necessary first step. To be well and roundly informed, that same shelf should be long and bulging with all the fine books and recent journals that have been published on our county. For the anecdotal, the humorous, the poetic, the fin de siècle, excuse my pronunciation, fustiness, the variety of material, My Clonmel Scrapbook will continue to serve its part. I wish I'd go on. The new publishers, every success with this venture, and I hope the book again will sell in thousands. But I hope too that it will reach a newer, younger, and more enlightened readership that will have the interest to be fascinated by the detail, but the judgment also to see its selection of views as part of a richer and more realistic tapestry of our life and times. Now, my foreword finished there. And my dear friend Phil Roberts, who has been very ill in recent years with Parkinson's back in England, asked me to make one change. I think it was one word somewhere. And I debated it with myself and decided I couldn't change. I'd put a bit of work into that forward and it would have to stood. And Phil accepted that, and fair dues to him. And he went on to sell many thousands of copies of the book, all printed by himself and his family in his own basement in Queen Street in Clonmel. I myself went on to explore the famine and to write what turned out, of course, to be a very, very controversial thesis when I went back to college in the 1990s. And I wasn't looking for controversy or anything like that, but I got into the type of controversy that was a little bit like genocide denial stuff, and thereby hangs another tale. I wrote, I think, a fine thesis on the subject. I did a full-length film script, which I tried for some time to get made, but that didn't work. I've written a radio play that wasn't published, and I talked and was driven out of many History Society talks over the years. But I do not change my own interpretation of the history of those terrible times. I will probably talk about that in another YouTube video, audio at some stage in the future. Anyway, if you remain so long, thank you very much. Subscribe if you would, and what's the other thing that you do? Ring a bell or something like that, and thanks very much for listening. Goodbye. A little extra, a little scrap from the book, the much quoted, we'll call it a poem, The Two Travellers, that Ciarán Mac Mahuna used to very regularly bring up. And I read it because it kind of celebrates, as I said, my own area, my own small area, Feathered and Mullinahone and Drangan and Laffin's Bridge and Horse and Jockey. And it was called The Two Travellers. Just an excerpt from it, a few excerpts from it. All over the world, the travellers said, in my peregrinations I've been, and there's nothing remarkable living or dead but these eyes of mine have seen. From the land of the ape and the marmoset to the tents of the Philaheen, said the other, I lay you an even bet by you are never in Farnaleen. And I've hunted the tigers in Turkestan, in Australia the kangaroos, and I lived 6 months as medicine man to a tribe of the Kathmandu's. And I've stood on the scene of Olympic Games where the Grecians showed their paces. The other replied, Now tell me, Jimmy, were you ever at feathered races? Don't talk of your hunting in Yucatan or your fishing off St. Helena. I'd rather see young fellows hunting the wran in the hedges of Tubarahina. No doubt the scenes of a Swiss canton have a passable sort of charm, but give me a sunset on Slieve na Mon from the road at Hackett's farm. And I'd rather be strolling along the quay and watching the river flow than growing tea with a cute Chinese or mining in Mexico. And I wouldn't much care for Sierra Leone if I hadn't seen Killinall, and the man that was never in Mullinahoney shouldn't say he had travelled at all. The author of that was the very, very prolific C.J. Boland. That Margaret Rossiter, the wonderful Margaret Rossiter, who's tops 100 at the moment, was interviewed on RT Nationwide there very recently, and she's still going strong and a great advocate of C.J. Boland. Bye. Bye-bye. Shinawil.